the show is called Why Isn't Everyone Doing This? And you've had such a unique opportunity to interview some of the world's most brilliant, most advanced, most evolved thinkers, philosophers, activists. And so I'm wondering if there's something that's really struck you of like, wow, this thing is so good. Why isn't everyone doing this? What comes to mind when you think of that question?
Yeah, it's funny when I was thinking of that question as I was, perusing your feed, like 20 things came up. I'm like, why isn't everyone, doing, cold water therapy or fasting or resistance training or leaning into hard, stressful conversations or, I've started to adopt all sorts of bizarre protocols where like I don't sit in chairs as much, I squat.
Are you squatting right
So
now?
no, that would be tricky. I can make it through an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm in a squat, but I don't think I can make it through a whole
Like a chair pose
podcast.
squat?
No, just like a squat, like, just,
Like you're in India
down
taking a
on my
photo on the
heels.
side of the road.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And really that's a lot of how I started to think about my own body and health is how do I align how I live, my culture, my lifestyle, with my inherent engineering. So we developed, this genome that is still quite Paleolithic, over hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years if you include our hominid ancestors. And and in a very, very short time, we have adapted our culture in a way that hijacks our biology. And there's so many examples of that, from sedentary living to temperature neutrality to our constant 24/7 eating cycle to on-demand entertainment to comfy chairs and couches and shoes made of like tons of plastic, et cetera. And I mean, we were just talking about before, we started recording, also just that we replaced face-to-face communication with a form of sort of, digital warriorship that, that really, it doesn't just, create a more invidious culture, but it also flies in the face of our evolution. We were, really evolved to be in community and to cooperate. In fact, our biological imperatives necessitated that form of community that we actually counted on each other to live. And we've sort of misunderstood and twisted this sort of notion of survival of the fittest. It's actually adaptive to be in community. But now, of course, we have, sanctified the individual in our culture, and we've created kind of all of this, technology that ends up in a lot of social isolation and loneliness. And so we need to, really take a hard inventory and look at our lives and try to, essentially realign ourselves with this miracle that is our biology. That's the product of like tens of thousands of years of nature's tinkering. And so, when I think about just why isn't everybody doing this, like 4 years ago, I hit kind of my own kind of rock bottom, and I started to interview hundreds of, doctors and mystics and sages and
Is it
regenerative
pre-2020? You hit a
agriculturists,
rock
et cetera.
bottom before 2020? You were just ahead of the curve?
I did actually. Yeah, I was slightly ahead of the curve. Yeah, I had a very acrimonious exit from my last concern, which some people are aware of, called Wanderlust,
Just a little thing
and
called Wanderlust.
yeah, well, not everybody knows, but just for the 5-second nickel tour there, Wanderlust was a big series of wellness events that I co-founded, and we spread them all over the world, and there were thousands of people that would come to each of these events. And kind of at its peak, it had, I think, 68 events in 20 countries.
Yeah. And a
And of
studio in
course,
LA and amazing events in the Prospect Park in Brooklyn, which I spoke at. And it was a real movement, festivals in the summertime, ongoing events, a community all over the world. And so when you say an acrimonious exit, it was tricky, like, and that started the rock bottom for you.
yeah, well, I mean, it was a process. Sometimes I refer to myself as the insoluble fiber of Wanderlust. Like I kept the company regular, but eventually it expelled me out its anus. Um, and I mean, that whole period that, my whole adventure in health and wellness with Wanderlust really ended up consisting of like 7-day, 20-hour per day work weeks, wicked insomnia, traveling nonstop, brain fog, chronic fatigue. When I left Wanderlust, I think I was 210 pounds. So, you know, and then I had all these other presentations that were violated my vanity, like, kind of dad bod and sort of just ghastly protuberances on my chest that are sometimes known as man boobs. More clinically, gynecomastia, I've learned. And and then, I kind of spiraled into a significant depression, after leaving, and I really had to take sort of a close look at like how my foray into health and wellness became an adventure in wealth and hellness, is what I call it.
Health and hellness. That's a
And
great line.
yeah, I know it's a little glib, I realize, but it is true for me. And, a lot of the symptoms that I just outlined are just so anodyne. They're so prosaic in our society. Who doesn't have brain fog and chronic fatigue? Like, ho hum, like,
And how sad that
but
that's normal.
well, that's exactly it. It's like my story is only interesting not because it's extraordinary. It's that it's so utterly ordinary, and that, we've normalized these conditions. But as I started to unpack them more and more, it's these conditions are just upstream from diabetes, heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, dementia, cancer, etc. And but they're so easy just to sort of pass off of. It's like, oh, I'm just having a bad day,
Or I'm
or
just
I just didn't get a good
aging.
night's sleep. Yeah. And then I put this little device on my triceps. So I know this is an audio podcast, but some people are watching a video. It's a little disc that sits in my triceps, and it's a continuous glucose monitor. And I peered into the app, and my fasting blood glucose was 125 milligrams per deciliter, and that is basically borderline diabetic. And so I was like, wait a minute, me? Nah, no, I'm like the Wanderlust guy. It's like I shop at Whole Foods, like I pay my taxes, I raise my kids, like I
I
don't
pay
have
my
diabetes.
taxes. I love that that's your glucose marker.
Yeah, right. I'm like, I'm an upstanding member of society. What happened? Like, and I went to my PCP. Of course, I'd canceled like every annual visit to my primary care physician. Something always came up. So I went to my PCP, and sure enough, she took my hemoglobin A1C, and it came back at like 6.5%. It's borderline diabetes. And I was like, oh my God, I'm living in the American nightmare. It's not just America. We've exported sort of the more detrimental aspects of America around the world. But, but 50% of us here in this country have diabetes or prediabetes, and like 90% are metabolically dysfunctional. And most people like me had no clue, had no idea. We're just living in this nightmare completely unaware. And I have a very different vision for my, my life, my dream. I want to, walk up into some mountainside cabin when I'm 118 and have my 100th anniversary with my dear Skylar, and pass off sort of without without a lot of pomp and
Yeah, I've
circumstance,
always dreamt of like
on a live
calling
a
my death date, of being like on the banks of the Ganges River and be like, meet me on Wednesday. And just like when my body feels not that relevant anymore, and just dropping it into the Ganges River. It's always been my death fantasy.
There it is.
At like 120 or so.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, these dreams are slightly maudlin, but I think the real point is that we want kind of our health span to match our lifespan, right? We want to, as Mark Hyman says, die young at an old age, right? So, and we want to be vibrant and free of sort of the more common, decrepitudes of aging. But most of us suffer from this like morbidity distension, where like the last 20 years of our life becomes a sort of a limp, where we're on multiple cocktails of pharmaceuticals, managing different symptoms of chronic diseases, et cetera. And I was kind of like, fuck that, no way. That's not the life I want to lead, but I also don't want to lead that for the people around me, because, that distension and morbidity kind of radiates out into your family and into caregivers. And it can be really like the source of a tremendous suffering, not just for the individual. And then I started reading about, the societal impact. So now we're, 20% of GDP, like $4.5 trillion on sick care, managing the symptoms of preventable diseases. It's nuts.
I mean, it's a big giant you're taking on. I just recently learned from our mutual friend Zach Bush that the pharmaceutical industry is bigger. It's a bigger business than defense. It's a bigger business than energy. I thought surely petroleum or arms was bigger than pharmaceuticals, but it's like many times bigger. So this is not a small mountain that you're climbing.
No, and there's these other dimensions of it that I think are sometimes overlooked. Like, my dad is 82 now, and he's been kind of in and out of cancer treatment for the last 5 years, but fortunately is coherent and cogent, and I look to him, for a lot of wisdom and advice, still, and that is the great exception, though. Our old people we used to consider them elders, these kind of fonts of wisdom, and that we could, through, years of experience, they would sort of accrue a very insightful understanding of how the world works, such that the younger generations could tap into that wisdom. But now, of course, like our elders have become the elderly. Chip Conley often uses that turn. And so often they're considered a nuisance, and we've shipped them off somewhere, and so there's just like every reason to focus a lot of time and energy, I think, on these topics about how do we live healthy long into our lives. I even think like the political morass sits atop the inflammation that we're holding in our personal bodies spills over into the body politic.
Yes. I remember, I think during the 2016 election, when things were first starting to really heat up and get so divisive, and I was like, maybe not engaging, but like watching some Facebook comment battle happening. And there was just a woman who was just so diametrically opposed to everything that I believed. And I was like, let me just go and look at her profile. Let me just try and understand this human who like vehemently disagrees with everything that I'm saying, and me, her. And all her feed was, and who knows if it's even a real person or a bot, but her feed was like pictures of her like drinking giant like gallons of margaritas and like out with her girlfriends. And I was like, oh, her body is inflamed. Her brain is inflamed. That sugar and that alcohol has created fire and heat in her body, and it is being expressed through rage online. And so I could not agree more that the chronic inflammation that we are holding in our nervous systems is showing up in some of this political fiery debates.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think one particular party has a monopoly on that either. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just, if you are working, 2 part-time minimum wage jobs and have diabetes and can't afford your insulin, and the only place that you can shop is 7-Eleven, I mean, you're probably pretty pissed off,
Yep.
and you're probably very justifiably pissed off.
Yep.
And that inflammation, as you say, that we hold in the body, punctuates your interactions in your daily life.
Yep.
And so, so there's just, I think, like every reason in the world to be focusing, on these issues. And I think we can do a lot to solve, so many of our different societal ills by focusing on, what it means to be truly well. So, I took that upon myself, and jumped into kind of my own petri dish and became sort of the N of one experiment on the organism that I had the most agency over. and and I, honestly, because of my, that I do have access to a lot of very interesting people, I tried quite a lot of different pills and praxis and mushrooms and modalities and whatnot. And so, and I will say, our world is rife with people selling things. So, I had to sift through a lot of grift. But at the same time, I think I was able to kind of distill a number of protocols that were really, really effective for me, and I think are very generally effective because we do share, for better or worse, Emily, 99.1% of our DNA. Sorry about that.
99.1% we share in common.
That's right.
And so, and this is like the basis of the book. It's like what worked. You used your amazing Rolodex of contacts. But what I'm hearing is that you found the things that really worked for you and that you feel like are universally applicable. And this is the basis of the book. Is that correct?
Yeah, really. I think when I started to unpack why I was so sick, and by extension, why I think most of the world is so sick, I put my thumb on one central idea, which is, chronic disease is really the result of chronic ease. Is that, we have engineered our lives for comfort, but that actually leads to a lot of long-term uncomfortable realities. And so, many of the artifacts of modernity that I listed off earlier, this kind of overabundance of shelf-stable calories, sedentariness, indoor living, total reliance on digital devices, social isolation, sort of perpetual drip of cortisol dysregulating, blue light from our omnipresent screens, et cetera. All of these kind of reflections of ease have really hijacked our biology. And so I went deep down that rabbit hole to really, really understand the mechanisms at play, like what's really, really happening there, kind of at the cellular level in a lot of cases. And it was sort of like an autodidactic medical school that I put myself through. It became kind of like amateur everything along the way, but really got a very solid understanding in terms of how physiology functions, how my body functions. And in a way, it was like a sort of a metaphysical quest too, because as I started to study the human body, I saw these kind of concepts that appear kind of more in Eastern religions and Eastern thought. I saw them mapped everywhere in human physiology, and it really came to this realization that if you really want to understand the metaphysical, then study the physical, because this is where the cosmic intelligence of the universe is patterned. And it was like every day was like a Satori, there for me.
Can you say more about that? Because certainly this podcast leans a little bit more metaphysical.
Sure.
And I know that
Yeah.
through all the amazing people that you've interviewed through Commune, you're very well versed in the metaphysical. But what did you find in your own physiology or as you were studying the actual 3D human body that was a fascinating overlay?
Yeah, well, so there's these concepts like in Buddhism or in Taoism, around Madhyamaka, like the middle path, for example, or in Taoism, kind of everything, every phenomena that emerges within the universe, has its opposite. So there's this concept of the coincidence or the coincidence of opposites. And we know that kind of through, hot and cold and bright and dark and, damp and dry. And a lot of the stuff that has been actually, studied in Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine. But when, you actually apply a Western empirical lens onto those things, you actually see them, in molecules. And what I started to understand is that the human body is actually engineered. Its core intelligence is to foster balance, is to foster a middle way between different pathways. So when you started to look at like a hormone, a chemical messenger in your body, like insulin, you would find that insulin, which could be considered sort of a yang molecule, a growth molecule, had its yin partner, glucagon. If you started to look at like a neurotransmitter, the things that kind of flow into your brains, these chemical messengers that either excite the brain or inhibit what's known as an action potential, you can see that glutamate, which sort of excites the brain and excites and stimulates action potentials across neurons, is also balanced by GABA, which is sort of the relaxation, neurotransmitter. And so I began to unpack like so many of these oppositional forces within the body, and they all have their yang and their yin. And that's a little bit of a simplistic way of looking at it, but the body is really designed to create this tenuous little balance. For me, I had super high glucose levels, but the body, the liver, really is designed to sort of maintain this middle way, to titrate just right, to keep this like 90 milligram per deciliter, tiny little balance in your body. And so much about being healthy, both kind of in your psychology and your physiology, are doing the things that foster this kind of balance. And, balance, like really in every single expression of it is really a reflection of balance. Obviously we talk about kind of psychological balance or centeredness or emotional regulation, et cetera. But you also see, like what does a balanced economy look like? It's generally one with a big bell curve, thriving middle class, or, what does a balanced agricultural system look like? Well, generally one with like a diversity of plants and et cetera. But so that is 100% true for the human organism too. And in the body, balance is called homeostasis. In a nursery rhyme, it's called the Goldilocks zone. So you're always looking for the warm porridge in your body.
And do you
And
think, so like
so,
when I hear
yeah.
words like middle way or homeostasis or Goldilocks zone or balance, my my attachment to that would be one of stillness almost, or that I need to, my interpretation would be like that, oh, for me to achieve this health, I need to stay in the middle. Versus what I am so excited about, what I'm studying, and so I'm obviously hearing it through that lens, is one of polarity, right? Of this like masculine charge and feminine charge, of this like yang output and then this yin restoration. And so I would like to hear you explain more. Like, did you find that it really is about finding that homeostasis and that balance in that middle path? Or is it about going and doing the big exertion and then making sure that you're balancing it with rest? Is it that if you eat the fat, that you're doing the vinegar, or so if you're eating the sugar, that you're balancing it with fat and vinegar? I would just love to hear you speak about the magnetism, the eros, the polarity versus the stasis.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, so many of these concepts in like Eastern thought have a kind of paradoxical nature to them. So when I sort of think about the feeling of ultimate health, it's kind of a passionate tranquility, or sort of a vibrant serenity. And those terms seem mutually exclusive, but we know they aren't byproduct of our own experience. We know that when we're immersed in some sort of collective enterprise or creative endeavor or playing sports or dancing or singing, that, that's it. It's sort of a complete awareness of yourself in space and time. It's a passion, but also a centeredness. And that's kind of that place on the seesaw where no one's feet are touching the ground, right? It's like this beautiful little moment. And to foster that, sometimes you need to self-administer acute forms of short-term like stress or shock.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm finding. So for example, like for me, I'm a regular ice plunger. There's so much psychology and mindset associated with that, and we can unpack that. But just from a physiological perspective, what that's doing to your body, it's plummeting your core body temperature. And then your body goes into like, super overdrive, like you say, that kind of polarity moment to upregulate your temperature back into, again, that Goldilocks zone, to that 98.6 zone. And it does that through activating the certain tissue in your body, these brown fat that is rich with mitochondria, and it's the most incredible way to burn fat, particularly if you're in a fasted state, because you need a tremendous amount of energy to make all that heat. And if you're in a low glucose state, your body has to burn fat or rely on a fat substrate to make that energy. And that is a very intense kind of acute form of stress. But what it actually leads to is an ability for the body to foster balance in the long run and to foster resilience and to activate these kind of longevity pathways. So like that's a great example of like a self-imposed stress that actually in the long term is incredibly adaptive.
Yeah.
And you can look at that in tons of different ways. And we talked like, like you can think about that even just interpersonally. What does it mean to have an intense, acute, stressful conversation with someone? So easy to avoid doing that.
I'm professional level at avoiding those conversations.
But long term, that's maladaptive.
Sure is.
But if you actually self-impose that stressful conversation and you go into it with the right intention and with the right tools, that's an acute stressor. But what that actually fosters in the long run is the middle way. It's cooperation. It's common ground. It's finding ways to work together. So,
and this is what we call hormesis, yeah, like acute good stress, right? Hormesis.
100%, yeah. And this hormetic response that is essentially the body's adaptive response to short-term stress.
And I just want to clarify because, I've spent 13 years proselytizing against the dangers of stress. And so I really want to highlight the difference between this hormesis, this acute good stress, things like ice plunge, sauna, yes, having the difficult conversation, high intensity interval training. Like if you think back even 100 years ago, what were our great grandparents doing? How much acute stress were they under that we've now, like you said, like created ease that is creating dis-ease? How are we like avoiding any acute stresses and then slowly killing ourselves in the long run?
Yeah.
And so
totally. Like, like it shouldn't be stressful to sit on your ass and do nothing. But it is now.
Because we're not designed to do that.
Yeah, it's like when we live kind of within this attention or persuasion economy where every single person, brand, family member, colleague, job person is vying for our time and attention, we live in this permanent state of distraction such that actually sitting and doing nothing has become stressful.
Whoa.
It's very strange, right? And so there's this fascinating paper written by these guys at Harvard. We might have talked about it once before, but I think Matthew Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert, they wrote this paper called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." So they were saying that the happiest people in the world are actually people that are thinking about what they are doing. So this is very like this is very Thich Nhat Hanh, like when you wash the dishes, whatever. but that the moment that we start to our attention starts to drift away from the thing that we're actually doing, that is a determinant of unhappiness.
I'm
And so
curious how
this
you
is
would conflate that with or juxtapose that to Dr. Srini Pillay. He's a Harvard psychiatrist. He wrote Tinker, Dabble,
mhm,
Doodle, Try. And he's basically pontificating of the benefits of non-structured time, like daydreaming, really, but this is different. That's like, oh, I'm putting time in my day to not focus. He talks about focus fatigue, which is different than this, where you're saying if I'm washing the dishes, my attention is on washing the dishes, and I'm not using dishwashing time to daydream. That's a separate
right.
time. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He's fascinating, by the way, and his wife is a wonderful physician. And so I think that there's two different things here, because a lot of knowledge and learning is actually consolidated in these times of sort of, like you say, wool gathering or daydreaming there, or in times of sort of deep rest, or
Meditation.
sleep, etc., meditation. So that is true. And at the same time, practices that focus on the single pointedness of mind, offer an incredible opportunity, I think, for long-term happiness.
Like skeet
Because
shooting, archery, like what would be an example of that?
sure, those, or just having a drishti or a mantra or a bead or anything that essentially, or obviously your breath is a very good one, just because you always have it, until you don't. But
And we're
for
all going to die.
podcast.
100% death rate.
Yeah. But what this paper suggested also that was interesting is that, thoughts obviously will never turn off that spigot. And that's often a confused target of meditation. But it's really our ability to follow the thought, watch it disappear, and then come back. The opportunity lies in the coming back to that single pointedness of mind. So whether that's coming back to the breath or the gaze point or the mantra. And the people that develop that ability or capacity to continue to come back appear to be the happiest people. So it's interesting. Certainly, I have found by dint of my own experience that engaging in a single pointedness of mind practice eventually began to punctuate my life in other ways. I became less distracted, a bit more able to read, or God willing, even write a book. So, and that certainly was not the case 5 years ago. I think I read 0 books in 2017. 0.
I think I've gone
Yeah.
the opposite direction because my life now, I have a 5-year-old son, sort of like post-divorce, post-pandemic, certainly more online, more social media, more employees versus I think back now of like writing my book while pregnant and then launching the book while breastfeeding. Like I still am like, I don't understand how I did that. And now I feel a little bit more distracted by all of the social media and just like you said, like all of the inherent, like the number of people with their own brands, the number of people who are entrepreneurs, the number of people who are vying for our attention, even forget about a social media feed, but just in your text messages, on your WhatsApp threads, it's like everyone's selling something. Everyone's trying to get you to come to their retreats. Whereas the same people who were, you know, insurance executives 4 years ago are now wellness entrepreneurs. And so it's just a fascinating, it's a fascinating
Uh,
change where everyone is selling their own wellness products now.
yeah. There's a neuroscientist named Adam Gazzali, really interesting guy, and he has a really interesting metaphor that uses kind of hunter-gatherer culture, so it's appropriate here, where he calls this information foraging. So imagine you're out kind of on the savannah looking for food, and 10,000 BC or something, and you come across a solitary fig tree. Well, hallelujah, you're going to completely denude that fig tree of all of its figs. You're going to be gorging on some, and then stuffing some in your satchel for the tribe, etc., until that fig tree has no figs left, and then back off you go, back to your tribe. Now imagine a situation where you came across like a copse of a grove of fig trees. So then you're gonna pick the ones that are right there at shoulder height, and then your attention's gonna drift over to that one next door, and you're gonna say like, "Oh, there's some really easily procurable figs right there," and then you go over and you pick that one, and then your attention goes over there, and you go and pick that one, and go and pick that one, and what you have at the end of the day is a lot of trees with just the most easily procured figs gone, right? So apply that now to kind of modernity and the information architecture of modernity. So what we have now is like you open an article or something on your phone, and within the first 100 words of that article, there's essentially another fig tree. There's a link to click over here, and you do this sort of little cost benefit analysis in your brain. You're like, I kind of got the gist of this thing. I'm going to go over here. And then in the first like little paragraph of that, there's a link to go over there and link to go over there. And of course, that is the ad revenue media model in a nutshell. It's like the more clicks that you have, the more opportunities there are to serve you up ads, et cetera. And that's how publishers make a living. But what we have now is this kind of information foraging where we'll never sit down in a chair or squat and read Moby Dick. It's just there's just not the environment for that.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly, taking in these tiny bits of information and then moving on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that that's not particularly profitable long term. If you are really trying to like accomplish something with depth or develop a true and profound understanding of something or write a book or
It does give me heart that podcasting is so popular, and I think it does speak to the way that we used to disseminate information, receive information, the fact that we are like ingesting these long form conversations. And sure, they're spotted with ads as well, but at least it's like a bit of an hour-long conversation, or a 2-hour-long conversation feels like such a luxury to have that depth of exploration in a world of clickbait and scrolling and memes. I think Elena Brower, our mutual friend, posted like, I miss my pre-internet brain. And so it does give me hope that people are consuming podcasts the way that they are, because at least this is an opportunity. And I do think some people are still reading, or audiobooks at least, while they're also on the treadmill and also cleaning their homes.
Yeah. No, 100%. I'm obviously kind of overgeneralizing there. And yeah, I mean, I think podcasts are a silver lining here. Mm-hmm. And I think podcasts honestly serve the podcasters as much as they serve the listeners, because as a podcaster, I'm never more present than when I'm conducting a podcast.
And like how much have you learned
there.
So that's what I'm interested is like, as you've been doing this guinea pig experiment on yourself, putting yourself through these good stresses, like what did you find to be the most effective? What changed things the most for you? We know cold plunging or...
Yeah. So I would say that there's two different categories of them. There was the stacking of a number of physiological good stressors. And I would say for me, that was intermittent fasting, cold plunging, and resistance training. That sandwich was particularly
so you would
gluten-free.
Do intermittent training, or sorry, you would do intermittent fasting and training and cold plunging while you were fasted. Is that correct?
Kind of. So basically, I became sort of a 16-8 person. So I would consolidate all my consumption of food within an 8-hour time period. And again, I was addressing, pretty significantly overweight and borderline diabetic. So there was good reasons to do this. And I tinkered quite a bit. And again, it's not for everybody, especially like, for women who are menstruating or pregnant or even in menopause. You really need to tailor these protocols for yourself. But for me, 16-8 worked really, really well. It began to bring my blood glucose levels down. And that what I found was that I would start my cold therapy, my ice plunging or my cold showers prior to breaking my fast because at that juncture I had very, very low blood glucose levels because I wouldn't have eaten for 15 and a half hours, let's say. And then my body would need to thermoregulate, and it would need a fuel source to be able to do that. And it had no choice except to break down my ample fat reserves into ketones and free fatty acids for energy. So that was really, really helpful. And then combined with resistance training. Now, I would eat generally before I would train. I would break my fast and then go eat. Although I did do a little bit of fasted training. I didn't really like that. I know some people like that and talk about it.
Yeah. In my circles, people are trying to say, like, hey, have the protein, like eat before you work out.
Yeah, I mean, you want the available. That's the only time I will eat significant carbohydrates is right before a workout because I know that there'll be kind of immediate uptake of that. But, I was this kid. I was a really chubby, teased kid. Don't cry for me. I had a decent life, but, this was a trauma that I've had to confront as a kid. And, I remember there were these like presidential fitness tests that used to be. Remember
I
those
do.
things? And one of the categories was pull-ups. And I could do a grand total of 0
I'm
pull-ups.
still at 0.
But I was too vain and embarrassed, so I would put 1 on my little scorecard. And I had this draconian gym teacher, Mrs. Brody. She wore like a kind of a referee's uniform and had a whistle. It was like very tight, and she called me out in front of the entire gym class. I actually never thought about this until like yesterday, and she was like, "Jeff Krasno, you cannot do one. Let's see you do 1 pull-up." And I was like, "Oh my God, this is just horrifying."
I lied. I'm getting caught in my lie, and I'm getting shamed.
All of the above. Yeah, it was awful. So, I had a chip on my shoulder, literally in this case, around pull-ups. And so I became an avid pull-upper. And I could do 0, then I could do 1, and then I could do 3, and then I could do like 8. And now I do 100 a day.
You do 100 pull-ups a day?
I do, although I got to just, in pure candor, I've fallen off a tiny bit. But for about a year, I did 100 a day.
That's amazing. I'm still working on my first one. I'm just holding myself for like 45 seconds. And I feel that's my starting point right now.
That's key. That's hard, actually. That's really, really hard. And that's definitely the place to start. But I always had a trouble developing muscle mass, and I'm certainly not bulging out of my shirt here. But as I found over time that the establishment of more kind of muscle mass serves as essentially a glucose disposal. It's like an incredible glucose sink. Muscles just vacuum glucose out of your bloodstream, even at rest. But when you contract them, you don't even require insulin to uptake glucose. So it's not as stressful on the pancreas, et cetera.
Yeah, we don't hear that much. We don't hear, we hear obviously like the benefits of strength training and aging and certainly like from vanity standpoint, but you don't hear that much about muscle metabolizing glucose, except for maybe Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. But I'm glad to know that that's been your experience and you're advocating for it.
Yeah, Gabrielle Lyon was a huge influence, and JJ Virgin, I've interviewed both of them, and that kind of idea of muscle-centric medicine and muscle as a metabolic tool was huge for me. So those were the 3 more physiological good stressors that I focused on, to reverse my diabetes and to get into better physical condition and to lose weight, et cetera. I would say the most powerful psychological stressor, in addition to to meditation and single pointedness of mind, was engaging in these stressful conversations. And in 2020, as we kind of anchored into lockdown, I started to write a column, a newsletter every Sunday, called Commusings, sort of dubiously named. And I was 2020 gave me a lot of fodder in terms of subject matter, given the pandemic and obviously the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing national inventory and social reckoning around racial justice, and then the election and every other possible emanation from Trumpistan. So I had a lot to write about. And of course, it was a very kind of triggered time. But the idea was like, okay, I'm going to send out these little buoys of hope every Sunday such that, people might feel less alone. And these were very sort of rigorously researched papers and thoughtful, I thought, anyways. And I included my personal email on them. And that database was like 1.2 million people. So on Monday morning, I would get, 500 to 600 emails incoming. And it was like cresting my inbox like a tsunami. And many of them were sort of, adulated the ego just enough, oh, this was great and interesting. I enjoyed it. But I would get like 100 a week filled with some sort of, acute criticism, often like replete with many expletives, and people that were, had found some issue with an idea or a turn of phrase or something. And some of these were just like, there was nothing I could do with them. Sometimes people would like copy and paste like Trump 2020 5,000 times and just send me, I don't know what to do with this. But it was, but then some people were thoughtful in their takedown. And I basically vowed to have an exchange. I would respond to every single email. And then, after the exchange, there was sort of a repartee that was developed. I would say, hey, do you want to join me on a Zoom call? And this was my great David Copperfield act, because generally people just disappeared at that juncture. It's like, put me on a stage in Vegas and watch me get people to disappear. Anyone want to have a Zoom call? But I had about 26 hour-long Zoom calls in August, September of 2020 with people that vehemently disagreed with me. And, the result was like I built my psychological immune system, or that's what Schuyler calls it. My ability to kind of remain centered, not to take things kind of overly personally, to basically, disarm insults by not giving them any power. But I also kind of inadvertently learned a lot of skills around having empathetic and nonviolent kind of forms of communication. And, Emily, it was so interesting. Like, these conversations took on such a recognizable pattern. So they were with people on the farthest edges of like QAnon and Trumplandia and that world, but there were also a lot of people like on the far left, kind of the defund the police crowd, or people that just didn't feel that it was appropriate for a white man to be kind of centering himself in a conversation about race or whatever. There's just a lot of people from all sides of the equation. And I would get on these Zoom calls, and, there would be kind of an exchange of pleasantries and it was sort of a hello. And then, kind of unlike this conversation, I would say basically nothing. And for 45 minutes, these people would just kind of gish gallop their life over me.
They would share personal stories, or they were going on about the topic?
No, they're personal stories. Yeah, I mean, you're right, the former. They basically just told me their life story. And I would say 5% of the time, we would get around to actually talking about the issue that originally had put us at loggerheads. But for 40 minutes, 45 minutes. They would essentially just tell me their entire life story. And it was just fascinating, especially like the third or fourth one. I'm like, whoa, this is just the same pattern every time. And so I just eventually, I didn't have any training at that juncture in like nonviolent communication. I mean, that's a real approach. This guy, Marshall Rosenberg, built this whole system around nonviolent communication. I eventually got into it because I was talking to my friends about it. They're like, you got to check out this whole system for this stuff. And I'm like, okay. But I was kind of instinctively doing some of it. So people would be talking about their life, and I would be like writing down of like, oh, I have daughters too. Like, oh, I was born in Chicago. Like, oh, yeah, I drove cross country and my car broke down. I would write down kind of places of life convergence between me and these people's stories. And then by the time they had exhausted themselves, I'd be like, oh, that's, I have 3 daughters too. We're in the 3 daughters club. And they're like, oh my God, what's that like? And I'm like, well, mine are teens now and it's crazy. And they're like, oh, well, mine are already flown the coop. And, you've got, empty nesting is hard, but, you've got a whole life in front of, it basically like just changed the whole tenor of the conversation. And I started to develop all these skills around it where it's like you'd walk into these conversations and you would not be looking for agreement. The solution was not the goal. Connection was the goal. And from that place of commonality and shared experience, I like made 24 frenemies, who I still text with. And these people are like still trumping about or still, on the far left or whatever. But, we found a way to see humanity in each other. And people, in the end, what I realized, Emily, really is that people just want to be seen and they want to be heard. And if you can create a safe and secure container for people to be seen and heard, there may be nothing better to spend your time on.
I want to celebrate you for writing those emails. I read so many of them and they just felt like they spoke directly to my heart. And it felt like such a gift that you were giving humanity using your outrageous depth of intellect, your vocabulary, the life experience that you have engendered through interviewing so many world leaders, and then to apply it to these very inflammatory and divisive subjects. But I had no idea that in the aftermath, you were going and doing these conversations. And it speaks so much to what I believe is some of the most important work that we could be doing on the planet right now. And what we were speaking about before we started the interview, which is that you are about to be brokering a conversation between some Palestinian folks, some Israeli folks. I don't know if they're Israeli or Jewish. But I would just love to speak to that a bit, because speaking of a subject that we might never find common ground on, we might never find a solution on, but can we find humanity? Can we find unity? And in so doing, in creating an environment where people feel seen and heard, which I 100% agree with you, that is all we're really looking for, is to feel seen and heard. Can we then find a way to peace, to collaboration, to some flavor of unity, even if we disagree? So I would just love to know, like, what inspired this? Can you give us a little bit more context? What is your goal in brokering these conversations? Anything you feel comfortable talking about?
Yeah, sure. So for me, kind of my selfish goal is to really try good stress on a situation that is highly.
And at what point does it turn into bad stress? Like, are you,
Yeah,
do you know what your line is personally, where you're like, oh, I'm now traumatizing myself?
That's right. So, essentially fostering thorny and hard, quote unquote, stressful conversations, with the goal of really trying to forge a path forward. So last fall, I interviewed a historian on, the socio-political, geographic history of Israel-Palestine, because I felt like, okay, before we go spouting off a ton of opinions, let's ground ourselves in, 5,000 years, 3,000 to 5,000 years of history, such that we can understand with greater nuance, the sociopolitical unrest that exists within this region. So we did. I did a tremendous amount of reading on the topic, and did a 3-hour podcast on the history of the region, from as an objective of a place as possible. Now, of course, every sentence could be subjective through someone's eyes or ears, but that was the goal, to really educate people and to ground people in the history. Though I did realize in the aftermath of that podcast is that, history then provides also the opportunity to accuse and to finger point and to say, well, but in 1918 there was the British mandate, but then you didn't accept the peace deal from in the Peel Commission, but in 1948 we were displaced too, but then in 1967 you guys were going to attack, so we had to do a preemptive attack, but 1973 you attacked again, and then the Intifada, and then we gave you and like it's just like there's this will just go on forever. The leveraging of history to assign guilt and blame. So my goal here is that instead of that, let's actually forge a path forward. What is the world that, as Charles Eisenstein says, our hearts know is possible?
Yeah, let's birth the more beautiful earth that our hearts know is possible. I quote him all the time.
And so in order to do that, for me, I believe that we're going to need empathetic communication. We're going to need a tremendous amount of trauma work. And we're going to need ultimately kind of institutional cross-generational forgiveness.
What does that even mean? Institutional cross-generational forgiveness? You mean like political organizations, nations, forgiving the past?
Yeah, I mean that certainly I think is an end point. Mm-hmm. I think kind of the starting point is even groups of 20, 30 people, being able to from different sides of the equation, being able to sit down and forgive the people, forgive the sons and daughters of the people that killed their parents. Or that oppressed their parents. And this work has been done. There's a brilliant doctor named Robert Enright. He's made his life's work forgiveness, both on the personal level but also kind of on the societal level. So he's gone into the most immiserated, war-torn areas in the world, and sat down with the Tutsis and the Hutus, and said, okay, there has been unimaginable harm done here, but can we forgive each other? Not just in our heads, but how does that forgiveness eventually take hold in the heart? And I mean, it's some of the hardest work, anyone might ever know. So, but I think these are the conversations that we need to begin to plant, like trees, because how else would we move forward?
What is the alternative, right? Like we play this timeline out, we know where we're heading. And so at what point do we jump timelines? And even to bring this back to the metaphysical, and JJ Virgin, so many of our mutual friends, there's a thing called 40 years of Zen, where you go into these chambers and you do like 10 hours a day of meditation while your brain is hooked up to these devices. And I had a bunch of my friends, Dave, Vishen, JJ, they all did it all in the same week. And they all changed, like dramatically. Their psyches changed, their emotions changed. And I was like, what were you guys doing in there? And they said, actually, forgiveness. We were just doing like 10 hours of forgiveness. And they were on lie detector tests and like heart rate variability monitors. And they would get to the point where could they actually forgive themselves? And could they say that they had forgiven themselves under a lie detector test? And this was the product of the 7 days of doing this very advanced quote unquote meditation, but it was all about forgiveness. And so this, I would love, I don't hear anyone talking about forgiveness as a political strategy, forgiveness as a way forward to birthing a new earth. And so I'm so grateful to you for starting to broker these conversations. Like if someone's listening to this and they were to want to take, think globally but act locally, how would you recommend that they start?
Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of, I mean, this is certainly not a new idea. I mean, there have been truth and reconciliation commissions, et cetera, for most famously in South Africa, where I spent actually a bunch of time in the 80s there when I was a kid. But there are, certain methods that are available to learn to then become a facilitator and a broker of these conversations. So, for example, if you are interested in pulling people together, over any divergence of opinion, political or otherwise, it doesn't necessarily have to be Israel-Palestine. It starts small. You could start with like
maybe
your
with
brother
your
and your
in-laws,
sister,
your,
whatever.
your
Yeah, right.
kids.
Yeah.
I know Tommy took your Barbie. You're upset about it.
That's true. There's an empathetic communication here. We know Barbie. She has a very lovely outfit. It's probably much nicer than Ken's. No, that there are these very codified approaches like nonviolent communication being one, where you can become a facilitator. It's quite rigorous, but you can become a facilitator in that approach to communication. And I've sat now in a number of those sessions. In fact, we hired a brilliant guy named John Kenyon to come and do our company offsite. Not that there's that much disagreement within the company, but we thought it was be an interesting set of skills to learn. And we did a whole afternoon session around nonviolent communication. Certainly, there's so much discussion, thankfully now, about trauma work right now. But how do you foster safe and secure environments for conversation? Because that's the key, right? The set and setting for these kinds of conversations needs to be safe and secure.
Yeah.
Because as you know, and as probably all of your listeners know, essentially, if you are not safe and secure, if you are in sympathetic overload or amygdala hijack or whatever, you're not going to be able to leverage, reason and rationality and compassion in your conversations. You're going to be in perma fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
And the knock-on impacts of being in that state, that is a more passionate, violent state. And so, how do you then foster safe and secure environments? And, you can just start that at the most benign, or I wouldn't say benign, I would say the most common everyday level. Start it in your home.
Start in your own
How do
nervous
you
system. Are you getting
Yeah,
out of
start
fight or
it. Yeah,
flight?
that's
Are
true.
you regulating your own nervous system? Are you feeling your own feelings? And if we start there, then we will help to contribute to every space we enter, right? If we bring a dysregulated nervous system into a yoga studio, we're going to dysregulate that yoga studio. If we bring our regulated nervous system into a really chaotic subway station, we're going to help to regulate that subway station. So I think it's like always starting within. And even just to bring the conversation back to, even if you don't want to study nonviolent communication or broker other people having conversations, I think to your point, if you can start having your own difficult conversations, like say the thing to your mom, talk to your ex-boyfriend, say the conversation with your roommate, and do it from a place of regulation. There's some really basic, I would say, like guidelines that, ask for permission, make sure the other person consents to it, write down like you were doing, take notes, say back what you heard, help them to feel seen and heard. Like there are some basics here that can go a long way. But what I've found just from my own experience is that when I have those difficult conversations, when I clear up those lies or, go have the conflict that I've been dreading so deeply for decades, that actually I get so much happier. And my coach says that lying is not a morality issue, it's a happiness issue. She's like, we're all liars. Just, what are you lying about and to what degree? Just so take your morality off of the table and just look at it as like, oh, the more honest I can be, the more happy I'm going to be. And then it feels like you're building up those muscles to be able to broker those conversations for other people as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Yeah, there's so many elements there to refine, or capabilities to refine. I mean, nonviolent communication specifically, centers atop of feelings. So before you even really confront, the particular issue at hand, it's like, how does it make you feel? Understanding each other's feelings in that way, and then moving from feelings to needs. So like, okay, well, what is the specific need that I have in order to feel a different way, and to be able to express that need with clarity, and to hear other people's needs with clarity, such that then we can such that we can feel a certain way. So that just like grokking some of these basic techniques, I think are really helpful. And then there was a whole other technique that I got interested in called steel manning, which is sort of, it's kind of like not a great name for it, but it's supposed to be kind of the opposite of straw manning. So a lot of people, you see this on the internet all the time, where people essentially ascribe an opinion to you that they can easily knock down as easily as they could knock down a straw man, basically.
Can you give us an
That's where that
example of
straw
that? Or
manning.
like what would be a real life application of that?
Yeah, like I'm trying to stay away from Israel Palestine for a second. Let's see, like just in the family, like someone borrowed someone's charger. This is what happens in my family a lot. It's like, you stole my charger, you don't care about me, or whatever. Like that's not the greatest example, but it's a decent one. But I think where steel manning gets interesting is that you can sit down with someone with whom you disagree, and you hear their particular argument, and as you're hearing it, you're notating the best, most convincing parts of someone else's argument. And then instead of issuing a rebuttal, you actually not regurgitate, you actually summarize the best part of their argument back to them. And it's very, very interesting practice. It can both help you see other people's opinions in equal proportion to your own, and candidly, it can also fortify your own position, because you are now, instead of like straw manning, just like basically saying, that doesn't make sense, you're actually taking the best parts of someone else's position and then having to actually put them through your own analysis.
Well, that's like
And
debate
in many
tactic, right?
ways,
You're in the debate club in
yeah,
high school. You have to debate both sides of an argument.
that's right.
And I think it
Yeah,
also goes
exactly.
back to the original thing of what we're saying, is that everyone wants to feel seen and heard. And so if you not only receive them and let them know that you really see and you really heard, but then make them look good, right? That you're like amplifying it as you mirror it back, that's going to not only let them feel seen and heard, but validate them in a way that will likely create more unity. And like you said, it will either allow you to change your mind or strengthen your position.
Yeah, so I think these are some of the techniques and into what I call stressful conversations. And I think the moral of the story there is that short-term pain generally yields long-term gain, right? So what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, et cetera. There's a lot of maxims that get
A lot of
applied
80s
to this
pop songs written
concept.
about this.
Yes, I'm never sure if that was Nietzsche or Kelly Clarkson, not one or
Same,
the other,
same.
but same, pretty much.
I'm curious to
I mix
know
them up all the time. Yeah.
what have you changed your mind on in having, it doesn't have to be from these particular conversations,
Mm.
but I'm always fascinated with the humility that it takes. And you're very public with your opinions, very public on the podcast. Has there been something significant where you have changed your mind? And if so, what?
No, I've never changed my mind. No, no, just kidding. I there's a few different things. I mean, there was this one particular situation where I remember I wrote an essay for the 4th of July. And instead of calling it Independence Day, I called it Interdependence Day. And I think the metaphor was, you know, I used sort of the highway as a metaphor for like true equality, and where our self-interest and the communal interest are one and the same thing. It's like, you know, you can't drive dangerously on the highway because you're not only risking someone else's life, you're risking your own life. And in a way, I don't remember all of the nuances of this particular essay, but I kind of hearkened back to our founding fathers and the principles that they had laid out in the Declaration of Independence, and then of course sort of the messy history of our country to better align ourselves in our human condition with those high principles. And of course the intention was I think good and admirable there, but there was a woman who took great offense to the phrase founding fathers. And she was an African-American woman, and she's like, they're not my fathers, nor did they give me any independence. And I'm like, yeah, but come on. I mean, I'm just using that phrase. Everybody knows what I mean. You know, I'm trying to like write an essay here about the fact that we're all in this together, right? She's like, yeah, but that phrase, you need to expire that phrase. Nobody should use that. And I'm like, yeah, come on, but you know what I mean. She's like, what you mean might not be what I hear. I was like, okay. So I actually took that home for a moment, and I sat with it. And at first it seemed kind of petty to me. I was like, this is Jefferson and Madison and, you know, whatever. But then, you know, I started to think about the fact that, you know, words do matter, and words do get retired. You know, they do expire. And just because I meant something in a particular way doesn't mean that someone hears it in that same way. So it's like, I think of like, if we want to modernize this, like from the river to the sea, for example, some people don't mean that as the extermination of all Jews and like the, you know, the end of Israel. But that's the way a lot of Jews hear it, you know, for example. So in this particular case, I was like, you know what? I'm ready to expire that phrase in my own lexicon, and I'll use something else. You know, I'll use framers, like our founding framers or whatever. I don't have to, you know, if this reads as patriarchal, then okay, you know, I can see that and I can hear that. And, you know, I'm not saying I'll never use that phrase again, if the literary context called for it, but in my mind, I kind of just expired it. I heard her, I recognized her point, and I was sort of willing to change, and I told her that.
Bravo. It was so interesting. And I don't know if there was like an energetic weight on the way that you said founding fathers, but when you said it the first time, it jumped out at me in a different way. And I was like, oh, it felt abrasive to me. And maybe it was just me psychically like knowing what you were going to go with the story. But then I wrote in my notes, I wrote founding mothers. And I was like, where are the founding mothers? And would we perhaps have more interdependence? And would we have perhaps more of that polarity and that middle way that you spoke about if we did have more of the feminine in the generation of the, you know, Declaration of Independence? And would perhaps more people have been given their independence if we had both a masculine and a feminine viewpoint in the room where these laws were being made? I don't know the answer, but it's an interesting inquiry.
Well, I mean, candidly, like I think a lot of the concepts, the highest principles that you know were etched on these parchments, in our Constitution, we're very feminine in nature, and that many of like the most long-lasting components of liberal democracy were perpetuated and taught in the home by women. So if you actually read like the Constitution, it sounds, the language that is used, like we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, general welfare, common defense. It's using language that one might ascribe to being kind of more feminine, around cooperation, around community, around bringing people together. And, it's obviously like the application of all of that language didn't apply, equitably.
Same with the
And
Bible, right? It's like we've got a lot of
right.
really beautiful teachings in the Bible that are being used as weapons.
But I would say that there are, that some of the best ideas, in our founding documents were ideas that one might kind of categorize as yin in nature. And I mean, Lynn Twist, I remember we talked about this, I think, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, that she has this kind of wonderful prophecy, right, of the great condor unfurling its feminine wing. And this is kind of in the, I can't remember what she calls this generation, but it's essentially like, a bird that has been flying in circles because it's only been flapping its one masculine wing. And so now we're kind of living in this moment, where we will unfurl both wings and soar. And, kind of bring it back to balance and, physiology, for example. It's like we live within a culture of growth, and we sanctify that growth at every turn, whether that's kind of, in our biceps, or like in the
Bank
Dow
accounts.
Jones Industrial or whatever, in the bank accounts. But we know that nature, requires this balance between growth and repair and restoration. And, that's why I think we need to focus on, mechanisms of repair and restoration. And we can do that, through a lot of these protocols, whether that's actually having, conversations or not stuffing our face 24/7. So,
Okay, you're going to eat a meal. Now we need to digest the meal. You've avoided the conflict. Now we're going to have the conflict. It's like dancing
yeah.
in that polarity, the action and the rest, the intake and the digestion. It makes so much sense. And I really appreciate the microscope with which you have looked at this, and then the macroscope that you've really been studying it with such intricacy inside of your own physiology, and you've been studying it for so many years inside of these spiritual philosophers and these spiritual texts, and to see the intersection of them. Because at the end of the day, there really is only one thing, and we really are it. And we just keep trying to complicate it and avoid it. But it's like, oh wait, as within, so without, as above, so below. And it's really beautiful to hear the way that you articulate this with such a wealth of both intellectual knowledge and now lived experience inside of your own body. So I'm not sure that we ever landed, but if you had to name this episode, why isn't everyone doing this? Like, what's the one thing, if you wish that everyone was doing, that you found is so good, what would you say? Well, how would you answer that question? Why isn't everyone?
Yeah. Don't seek out endless comfort and ease. Inconvenience yourself, because in the long term, that inconvenience is going to lead to a lot of resilience, a lot of longevity. And, in the end, I think we want to live with ease and we want to die with ease, but not the kind of chubby hubby Netflix lie on the couch kind of ease. What we're looking for is a vibrancy of soul, and a tranquility and a centeredness of mind, that will let us, enable us to live and die with ease. And, in this day and age, what that often means is self-imposing some things that don't seem easy. And, what I've found in my life is that doing harder things makes doing other harder things easier. And, that's my MO.
Yeah, it feels like, why isn't everyone doing hard things so we can live with ease?
Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go. Thanks for that. You did it for me.
And so I'm quite sure that people are going to want to soak in more of your wisdom. You are the host of an amazing podcast, which I've been a guest on twice now, I think. So where can people find you? I want to know if you want to share about the book some more. I know that people will be curious about that as well.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and your community. So I pretend to run a concern called Commune. I do run it, but it's really a team effort. And that website is onecommune.com. So that's ONE commune.com. And we have just the most wonderful teachers there, many of whom are very recognizable. And I have a little imposter syndrome sitting up next to them. But I have my own course up there on Stoicism. And then I'm launching this course called Good Stress. So you can go to onecommune.com/good stress. And the book will come out not for another year, but, chop wood, carry water till then. And I host the Commune podcast where I get to embarrass myself publicly on a weekly basis. And if only out of vanity, I read a lot of books in preparation for those podcasts. So I hope people can tune into that.
Yeah, you're such an amazing interviewer, and truly your vocabulary is, I feel smarter just listening to you. So I think it's one of the sexiest qualities in a human is their vocabulary. And you're one of the most eloquent, verbose humans I've met. So Jeff, thank you so much for your lifetime of dedication to finding your own truth, finding your own way, using yourself as a guinea pig, for highlighting and creating a platform for so many of these messages to reach a wider audience, and for the introspection and honesty that you have with yourself. It's really, really beautiful. So thank you for joining me, and thank you to everyone for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. I hope that it has inspired you to do some hard things so you can live a life of greater ease. I hope that it has inspired you to find that middle way within yourself. And if you've enjoyed it, then I would love for you to maybe take a screenshot. You can post it on Instagram. Jeff, are you on Instagram? If they tag
I
you, what should
am
they tag you?
just at Jeff Krasno.
Yeah, at Jeff Krasno with a K. I'm at Ziva Meditation. And if you've enjoyed this media as medicine, the best thing you could do for us is to share it with your friends and your families. Anyone who you think might be slowly, I mean, don't tell them I said this, but like slowly killing themselves with ease. Maybe you could send them this episode with a little inspiration to take that cold shower or to do that high intensity interval training. But we love you so much, and we will see you next week on Why Isn't Everyone Doing This?